and welcome to another episode of Kiosk. Kiosk is a coalition of independent media that includes Plebity, India and Global Left, and others. I am Jyotishman from India and Global Left, and with me is my co-host,
Elke Oschorov-Heidecke, and originally from Germany, now sitting on the west coast of the United States. Hello.
Today we have with us a very special guest, Richard Heinberg. Richard is a senior fellow of Post-Carbon Institute and is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates of for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He is the author of more than 14 books, including some of the seminal works on society's current energy and environmental sustainability crisis. Richard, welcome to Kiosk.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
Yeah, Richard, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. And I would love to kick us off with a question that is related to your being a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. And so I just recently heard that it turned 20 years, and I would love to get your vision for like what would a post-carbon future look like?
Well, it's a huge question.
I know.
And I've spent the last 30 years trying to come up with answers to that, and it's it would be like trying to describe human civilization today. It's big, it's fast-paced. Well, what's a post-carbon civilization going to look like? Is civilization even possible in a future constrained by resources and unstable climate? I think that's an unknown at this point. We really don't know what it's going to look like. What we can say is fossil fuels have enabled us to create a way of life that we take for granted today, but is fundamentally unsustainable. The scale of energy usage, the pace of financial interactions, of travel, of resource extraction and transformation and usage. Basically, the economy, we've created an economy on a scale that probably cannot exist without fossil fuels. And it shouldn't exist anyway, because if you look at what this economy is doing to nature and the prospects of future generations, to other species, it's off the charts. It's completely unsustainable. So we know that a post-carbon world is going to operate by different rules. It's going to have to be truly sustainable, which means that we won't be able to continue drawing down finite resources from the Earth's crust. We won't be able to continue dispersing wastes into the air, water, and soil the way we have been for the past few decades. What that looks like, does it look like, hunting and gathering? I don't know. That's one possibility. If human societies can even survive in a world of such extreme climate variability, we don't know that. But we at least know that what we're doing right now is not working and can't continue. And so finding some way down from the precipice that we're on, that's cooperative and that's peaceful, seems really, really important, because the end of the fossil fuel era could be, we could go out with a bang and leave nothing behind, and that would be a terrible tragedy. So if we know we can't continue doing what we're doing now, and so that presents us with a huge challenge for how to rethink human society on a smaller scale, lower resource usage, and so on. And nobody wants to think about that currently. Right now, we're all on the path of, we have to grow, more.
Or
And
only a few people are thinking about it, maybe.
yeah, a few people are thinking about it.
And also different people have different urgencies to think about it, because
Yes.
there is some impacts already existing. So did that all also make you like think about power and write the book that you called?
Yes. Yeah, well,
Tell
thanks
us
for
more
mentioning
about
the
it.
book. Yeah, I spent a few years working on this book on power, and learned a lot in the process of researching it and writing it. I started out with the suspicion that, you know, all of this somehow revolved around power. And in English, the word power uh, has two meanings. In other languages, those meanings are differentiated with different words. But in English, when we use the word power, we can mean either social power or physical power. Physical power, you can kind of boil down ultimately to the ability to do something, and the ability to do something requires energy. So a physicist would define power as the rate of um, energy change. Okay, so and that's a perfectly good or energy transfer. That's a perfectly good definition of the word power. But in ordinary conversation, a lot of English-speaking people use the word power to refer to you know, kings and billionaires and celebrities and social power. So if physical power is the ability to do something using energy, social power is the ability to get other people to do things. And so the book really is about the evolution of physical power and social power through biological evolution and through social evolution. And obviously I could talk about the book for a long time because it's 400 pages, but just to encapsulate it in a nutshell, my argument is that while power is a good thing, we need power in order to do anything at all. Nevertheless, it's possible to have too much of a good thing. And fossil fuels, as a concentrated source of energy, unlike anything that we had ever used before, fossil fuels have given us so much power so fast that it's like having too much of a good thing, way too much in this instance, because it's enabled us to run roughshod over Earth's environmental systems to our own peril and the peril of future generations. But it's also enabled us to build up far more social power in the forms of wealth disparity, the ability to control communications among humans, again, than is really good for us or for our future prospects. So the only solution to these problems that we're facing, whether it's climate change or global inequality, the only solution involves giving up some power. In some cases, it requires humanity giving up power, like the energy that we get from fossil fuels. In some cases, it involves some humans, like the billionaires, for example, giving up power so that we avert the social crises that are being created by increasing economic inequality. So is it possible for us to give up power? And I spend a good part of the book showing that, in fact, this happens all the time. That's what a lot of social evolution has been about. In recent decades, you know, you have governments finding ways to increase the taxation of high earning people. It's called progressive taxation, or government programs to distribute wealth to those who have less. Well, that's a form of, you know, power reorganization. But we see the same thing throughout nature. Predators evolve in ways so that they don't kill all of the prey that they possibly could, because if they do that, if they run that experiment, then the predator goes extinct. So nature has found ways of balancing. Even in our own bodies, we have homeostasis, so that there's a constant balance being maintained between the forces within the body. So we know that we can moderate power for long-term survival. So why aren't we doing it with climate change, for example? And the answer that I propose is that we've had so much power so fast that we've developed incorrect beliefs about it. And some of those beliefs are that growth is always good, that if we use up the earth, we'll be able to populate other planets and continue doing what we've been doing it elsewhere by other means. And that human beings are not subject to limits. You know, all limits are bad, and that it's the purpose of human beings to overcome all natural limits. These beliefs, which were not shared by indigenous societies, by the way, these are very recent beliefs that we have acquired during the fossil fuel era. Sometimes you see it in popular literature, like Star Trek, for example, the idea of going out into the universe and colonizing other galaxies and so on. This is crazy stuff, really, when you look at it in terms of biology and you know, the things we've just been talking about. But
to this point, wouldn't it be also that like historically empires always were like
yes.
thinking of growing and expanding, and does it not seem like something that is inherent human or inherent in some, at least some strain of our thinking?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't say that it's inherently human, but it is an idea that had already been around in seed form. And you mentioned empires. And really, the fossil fuel era would not have taken off if it weren't riding on the back of European colonialism. Because European colonialism created this mental space for the idea that, you know, at least for some human beings, you know, the sky's the limit. We can take over everything. We are the correct, righteous people who deserve to rule the world, right? And that already had broken down traditional ways of thinking that were more place-based and more modest in scope. And that laid the groundwork then for the fossil fuel era to completely change human ideology in even more radical ways. Yes.
One of the finest books I have ever read, it's a little bit academic, called as The Great Divergence, that basically talks about the history of how did advanced industrial nations actually became advanced industrial nation. And the thesis explained was basically the edge that Britain got because of discovery of coal that was accessible to it, and also the colonization of the American colonies that actually allowed a lot of imports of primary commodities that allowed Britain and others in Europe to stave off pressures from land, which was very essential to come out of the Malthusian trap.
Yes.
I guess this is a good segue for me to ask a question, since we are talking about the great divergence between nations. On one hand, we are talking about the climate, or let's say post-carbon world, which is at a global scale. It's not nation specific. And on the other hand, there is a lot of unevenness. We relate rightly the problem of climate change with the industrial world. So all the targets, etc., are always expressed in terms of pre-industrial world, 1.5 degree pre-industrial, below pre-industrial, and so on. And yet, as someone from the global south, or who focuses a lot on the global south, I see that a long struggle in the global south has been to industrialize somehow.
Yes.
And they has not been able to structurally industrialize, by which means that a lot of the population still lives in the agriculture sector. Obviously, if one goes back to the 50s and the 60s, there was a belief that there has to be an occupational transfer. Now that has been challenged increasingly. Now people don't really think that that's necessary, but I think this idea is still around that we have to industrialize. What are your thoughts on that insofar as
Mhm.
the problem climate change is concerned?
Well, ultimately, I think the industrialized countries are going to have to largely deindustrialize. Uh, there's a phrase that's used in the climate literature: contraction and convergence. You know, contracting the overall throughput of resources for the global economy, and then converge on a way of life that's sustainable for everybody. I think that's a really good way of thinking about the situation. It's optimistic, but maybe we can afford a little optimism still. I don't know. But
Big
as I
question
say,
mark
that
there.
it is going to require the industrialized countries to significantly deindustrialize, and that's going to mean changing direction of a lot of trends that are now fairly long-standing and taken for granted. For example, you mentioned agriculture. The trend with industrialization is for an ever smaller percentage of the population to engage in farming. In the 1790s, it was about 85% of the American population engaged in agriculture. Today, it's more like 1 or 2%. And so as this smaller percentage of people is directly involved in food production, they more and more people are available to work in factories or data centers or whatever. And this contributes to economic growth, the growth of the middle class, and it's seen as beneficial to everyone. But in a post-carbon, post-fossil fuel society, I think we're going to actually need more people involved in basic food production, whether it will be 80 or 90% as it was in the 18th century. I don't know. There are various ways of getting more people involved in food production that are, not necessarily full-time. The whole idea of permaculture, which is it's a whole design philosophy. It's been around since the 1970s, and the people who are familiar with it are, evangelists for it, and think it can, basically solve all the world's problems. And lots of other people have never heard of it. So it's one of those things where, but I think permaculture is a terrific way of thinking about the human situation, the human problem in our historical context, and finding a way out that is, relatively unpainful, but it involves learning about how soil works, how plants grow, your local climate and situation, and how to produce food sustainably within that, and how to negotiate things like labor and time and land holding and so on in ways that are, again, fair and sustainable.
I
So
see in the background there another
yeah,
problem for the transition lurking, which is like the idea of permaculture and like ending the fossil fuel-based industrial agriculture and move more to land-based and decentralized agriculture. But the access to land is a giant problem.
yes, it is.
And so if we talk about the ideas of permaculture, we also have somewhat include in the discussion, in my feeling, it's like include in the discussion who has access to land and who can actually participate, or how do we transition from a centralized, maybe I'm using a wrong word here, but move from not having access for the majority of people really to also distribution of land access.
Yeah. Well, the only path to get us there is some kind of land reform. And that's really required, especially in places like the United States, where so much land is owned by so few people and corporations. And it's generational too. People in my generation, the so-called baby boomers, uh, most of the land is owned, is tied up with older people. The average age of an American farmer is, last time I looked, I think it was 58 or pushing 60. And now, the average farm size in the US is hundreds of acres. So what we need are much smaller farms with ownership available to younger people who don't have the economic means to, go out and buy 500 acres of prime farmland in Iowa. So that's going to require some kind of land reform. Now, when I talk to people in my generation, I always suggest to them, hey, if you own land or if you know somebody who does, you should be getting in touch with some young idealistic people who actually want to farm as a way of life, because you could be a conduit for enabling something beautiful to happen there. So far, I don't know if anybody's taken me up on that. I haven't haven't gotten any direct replies to that plea, but that's what should be happening. There are a lot of young people who see farming as a rewarding and honorable way of spending your life on planet Earth. And they should have access to land to do that with. So anyway, enough of that soapbox.
Well, I'm also thinking about like global financial institutions that actually further and foster not only like fossil fuel-based agriculture all over the world, but also actually foster the like global access in the global south to land for the global north. And so what do you think about, or any thoughts that you?
Yeah, I mean, when we get into the realm of this is what the really powerful people should be doing, there are lots of good suggestions. Governments, corporations, big banks, and so on. They have an enormous amounts of power: political power, power of communication, economic power. They could be doing things with all of that power that would be very helpful. But how do we get them to actually change course so that instead of serving the interests of this tiny group of already over wealthy people, they're serving the interest of the rest of the world and future generations and non-human species and so on? It's very difficult because right now all of the incentives are in the direction of just serving the interests of the super wealthy. And so that's part of what the book Power is about, how we've gotten into this cul-de-sac. And I wish I had a simple solution, but people have been working on this, better minds than mine, for some time now, and still we're still stuck.
I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask on finance, slightly a little bit specific perhaps, is what is now called as the finance gap insofar as climate funding is concerned. I mean, the funding under Paris itself, I guess last time I checked, was around 1.2 trillion that was pitched in 2021-22, and scientists are now saying that we might need at least 9 to 10 trillion by 2030 from, under Paris itself. That's over and above a lot of funding that should come from national governments. And the problem I see is, when I think about international financing, is a huge national inequality. In fact, literally hundreds of countries are in sovereign debt crisis now, which means that their payments of debt, including interests, far exceed what they get from, let's say, international institutions like the IDA under the World Bank. And so I guess my question to you also is about the UN, United Nations Framework for Climate Change, and the COP what they do itself, because a lot of people are hopeful about what they do, but a lot of people see them as mere gimmicks. I mean, COP28, we saw at Abu Dhabi, the president being the sort of chief of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Corporation. Um, what are your thoughts on the UN COP and the international climate financing in general? You are on mute.
Thank you. I've been getting over a cold, so I'm having to mute myself from time to time when I sneeze and cough. But yeah, again, it's a complicated situation because there are many people involved with the COP mechanism who are scientists or who are activists who are genuinely trying to move the discussion in the right direction. And so just dumping on COP and saying it's a gimmick is a disservice to those people who are doing their very best to use one of the few global mechanisms we have available to us to try to at least highlight the problem and try to do something about it. However, that said, on the other hand, it is true that the whole COP process is it's largely captured by powerful countries and powerful interests. The declarations of IPCC declarations are arrived at through committee processes that are almost guaranteed to produce reports that are too timid in terms of their diagnosis of the situation and too business as usual in terms of their prescriptions for how to deal with the situation. So it's the best we have, and yet it's far from being sufficient to actually accomplish what needs to be done.
Is one of the background questions also who is doing the financing for those like global institutions?
Yeah, that's not something I follow very, very closely. I mean, wherever you have financing, you have big pools of money, and that's a form of power. So that's going to follow the general rules of power, which are that as those pools get bigger, the level of corruption increases. And those who control the big pools of money are likely to be people who have the interests of themselves and other powerful people foremost in their minds, one way or another. That's just the way power works.
Well, my understanding is that the financing of the global north is all privatized, but there are throughout the world other financial institutions, like for instance, I think the State Bank of China, that is actually capable of forgiving debt, and because it's state-owned.
Right.
So what could be like avenues towards also like weaning off power from financial institutions?
Yeah. Well, a huge financial crash could possibly actually help things along in that regard. Of course, it would make a lot of people miserable in the process. But, as you've said, there's an enormous amount of debt that needs to be forgiven. All of this debt cannot be repaid over the last few decades, especially since about 1995, 1997. The rate of increase of debt globally has gone exponential. So the amount of power that could be wrung out directly out of fossil fuels and minerals and so on reached a point where, it couldn't be goosed much further. So the solution that was found by those in power was to increase our collective wealth by other means, and that was through the creation of credit and debt. which has its own long history going back 5,000 years. So what we've done is increase credit and debt far beyond what can ever be repaid. So there's a global debt bubble that's on top of the climate bomb. And so we're hoping to solve the climate disaster by spending a whole bunch of money that we basically don't have. What could possibly go wrong?
All right.
I think listening to you, I have, and perhaps as someone who calls himself a socialist, I think one of the things that strikes me listening to you, I mean, you are talking about radical land reforms, you are talking about uh, radical public control of finance and global finance. I'm also assuming you are on board that states, whether national or some global mechanisms under public control, should be at the center of our struggle against the climate crisis. We are also talking about controlling big corporate interests. Are you talking about socialism?
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is certainly part of the problem. For many years, I resisted talking about capitalism just because I live in the United States, and here where I live, capitalism is generally thought to be synonymous with freedom. Very few Americans have any clear definition of the word capitalism in their minds, or socialism, or any of the alternatives. So it's a pointless waste of words to even bring up the subject. But as I've studied the history and economics of the situation, I find myself in a situation where I just can't continue to avoid using the term. Capitalism, as it's grown up in its various forms over the past few centuries, is part of the problem. It's a way of concentrating power, both political power and financial power, that works very well for capitalists and makes everybody else miserable. And we have to find our way out of it. The economy has to be democratized. If there is an advantage to democracy as opposed to despotism in the political realm, and I think there is, then the same has to be said in the economic realm. Rather than just letting the capitalists take everything and run away with it for their own perverse self-purposes, we have to democratize the entire economy so that it works as well as possible for as many people as possible. Now, there's an even bigger perspective which says, well, that's just human beings. And that's just, this generation. What about future generations of human beings? And what about the rest of nature? So I think those perspectives need to be included as well. And I think it's possible in sort of a schematic way to design an economy that functions, that fills all of those requirements. It's just an economy on a different scale and of a completely different kind than we're currently accustomed to. And it looks a lot more like indigenous societies than it does modern industrial societies.
I guess I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, since you said it looks more like indigenous society, the other forms of environmental crisis that are not necessarily linked to the problem of climate, but they have their own forms. I'm thinking about biodiversity loss. I'm thinking about associated problem of food insecurity, severe degradation of our water resources, including dead zones in the oceans. And these are problems that many in the global south are also facing in a very dire ways. I mean, salt salinization for people who are involved in the global south on agriculture. I'm talking about very small scale agriculture. I've been reading a book on this small village in China called as Dafo village in Han province near Shandong. And one of the historic problems they have been facing is soil salinization, struggle around water resources and so on. So if you could lay out a little bit about what are the other forms of environmental stress and crisis that we are seeing along with the climate problem?
Right. I'm glad you asked that because I think too often our global environmental dilemma is just boiled down to the climate crisis. And it encourages the assumption that if we somehow technically solve the climate crisis, everything's clear sailing from then on, and we don't have to worry about anything. And the reality is that modern industrial society is digging its own grave in many different ways. And even if the climate crisis were somehow magically to go away tomorrow, there would be all of these other issues waiting to take its place, starting with resource depletion, non-renewable resources like minerals. Obviously, fossil fuels are depleting fast, but we're trying to solve the climate crisis by building, millions and millions of not just wind turbines and solar panels, but electric cars and batteries and new
The
kinds of
lithium
manufacturing
wars.
infrastructure. And all of that has to be constructed out of minerals that we're taking out of the ground that are non-renewable, depleting substances. And so some folks try to get around that by saying, well, let's just recycle everything. We'll have a circular economy. Well, good. Yes, we should be recycling more. We should be aiming for maximum resource efficiency. But the reality is recycling is never 100% efficient, never. So we're going to still be depleting, even in the best instance, we'll still be depleting non-renewable resources. Then there are renewable resources, fish, forests, topsoil, fresh water. We're depleting those faster than they can regenerate. So we need to, get back within nature's
recycling capacities.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's resource depletion. Then there's toxification. CO2 and other greenhouse gases are not the only forms of waste that we're emitting into the environment. We're using tens of thousands of novel chemicals that never even existed a century ago. And very few of them are fully tested for their biosafety or how long it takes them to degrade or what do they degrade into. I mean, it's, we just start using them. And a lot of these, it turns out, are bioreactive. They're hormone mimicking chemicals that are altering the reproduction of human beings and other sexually reproducing creatures throughout nature. For human beings, average male sperm counts have declined 50% in the last 35 years. Okay, that's kind of noticeable. Okay, so we're still capable of reproducing, but if you follow the curve of where that's headed, we don't have more than another 3 or 4 decades as a species. And that's just because of a certain class of chemicals that we know we're producing, we know they're out there, we know that the impacts they have, but we haven't gotten around to banning them yet. Okay, so there's toxic, and of course the impacts they're having on bees and birds and fish and so on. The impacts on the oceans, climate impacts, yes, but also the oxygen levels in the oceans are declining, heat levels in the oceans are rising. The bleaching of the coral reefs, which are the nurseries of the seas, and overfishing, plastics in the oceans. The oceans are really, really under stress right now in ways that haven't been the case since prior geological epochs, millions of years ago. You mentioned loss of biodiversity. It's not just loss of numbers of species, it's loss of the sheer number of insects and other animals.
I Sorry, I remember this Greta Thunberg's very short book that I read back in the days when Greta was emerging as a global figure. She had a very short um, handbook. These were They were essentially her collected speeches, and I remember, don't hold me on that, she quotes a number like 12 or 13,000 insect colonies disappearing every day. And like the first time I read, I felt like if it was not Greta Thunberg's book, I would have uh, checked it again, whether it's true or false.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the number.
yeah. Well, the estimates are that we've lost about 70% of the biomass of insects over the last 50 years that existed prior to that time. So 70% of the total biomass is gone. And if you look at a chart of vertebrate biomass, it's totally dominated by human beings and our domesticated species, cattle, goats,
Like the chickens in our backyard.
Yeah, the chicken is by far the most populous bird species on the planet. It's just off the charts. No, there's chickens, and then sparrows, and then, everybody else is hardly even visible on the chart. We are dominating the biosphere to such an extraordinary extent that we take it for granted. It doesn't even show up for us because we just think of it as normal. So those are some of the other problems that we're creating. That's not an exhaustive list because we haven't talked about artificial intelligence. We haven't talked about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, modern civilization is, as I used the term earlier, digging its own grave in so many ways, in such diabolical ways that it's, when you start thinking about it, it's easy to start thinking of human beings as conceivably an evolutionary mistake. I don't think that's true, by the way, because the history of human cultures goes back to ways of living that truly were sustainable and persisted for thousands and thousands of years. Modern industrial society, by comparison, is just a blip on the graph, a couple of hundred years.
I think I have a follow-up question on this on modern industrial societies, modernities, and what does it mean to reverse some of them? I mean, I'm thinking about whether in this post-industrial society I would have, you mentioned artificial intelligence and it's been used in all wrong ways, but I'm thinking about whether I would have my chat GPT, whether I can play my video games in that post-industrial world, whether I can play chess with someone in Germany. And this is essentially a behavioral question, not necessarily. We have talked about institutions and power. I'm just thinking about behavioral aspects of consumers. I mean, we grow up consuming so many things that we don't need. I mean, obviously we have to scale down, but to what extent do we scale down, and whether there would be any remnants of what we are using today? I mean, my father came from a peasant background, and I became middle class eventually because he got a job, but they all worked very hard. And they tell me it's not the sort of farming story of the United States. It's farming in the old world is much different. It's often means lack of accessibility to vaccines, to healthcare, sometimes even meals when monsoon rains collapses and your agriculture fails. And we all thought that we have made some social mobility by coming out of land, and that has been the sort of a very dominant idea in the old world about social mobility being tied to coming out of land. So my question is, it makes me a little bit nervous. Maybe I am too self-centered when people say that we are going back to pre-industrial or indigenous lifestyle, a hunter-gatherer or whatever. So just spell me out, or convince me a little bit, or tell me how stupid I am,
No,
perhaps
no.
thinking about my video games.
It makes me nervous too. You know, I live a thoroughly industrial lifestyle. You know, I'm talking to you via a computer. We have a refrigerator in our kitchen. We have solar panels on our roof. I drive an electric car, right? All of that is part of the industrial system. My father grew up on a farm in the American Midwest in Northeast Missouri. His family lived during the Great Depression when they I hear from people in the family who remembered this. When I was younger, I used to hear the stories about how they basically had no money. They would sell watermelons on the side of the road, you know, to get a little cash to buy shoes and school books and things that, you know, that they couldn't produce on the farm. But everything else, you know, they basically made on the farm from what they, you know, what they grew. So I'm separated from that by two generations, right? My father went to college. He was the first member of his family to go to college. He got a chemistry degree, became an industrial chemist. And then I came along and decided to play in rock bands, and you know, because it was the 60s and the industrial way of life that by then could be taken for granted. And so my generation came along and said, hey, you know, this is, we should be free. We shouldn't even have to think about this stuff. And we can go off and join rock bands and party and get stoned. So, you know, it's that way of living close to the earth is so far removed from our current experience for most of us in the industrialized world. It's very different, as you say, for many people who are still living very close to that situation themselves or still in it. But the reality is this industrial way of life we've created, for all its benefits, for all its ease and comfort and cleanliness and so on, it's not sustainable. It's simply, it cannot be sustained much longer. So we have to look at what the alternatives are. And they're not, none of them is perfect. Just like life in a modern industrial city is not perfect. You can look at all of the dangers and hazards of disinformation and getting ripped off by somebody on the internet and so on. These are problems that never existed before we had all this technology. And now we have all these new problems. So we're always going to have problems. The question is, can we negotiate our situation such that the problems are ones that are acceptable for over the long term, that are acceptable for groups of people living together in relative mutual harmony and in relative harmony with their surroundings. And I'm sure we'll be able to come up with lots of good ideas and traditions and, you know, agreements that will make life easy and happy. And by the way, modern industrial life does not make us happy. You know, being miserably poor, you know, yes, does not make one happy. But life in indigenous societies, even though it involved almost no wealth in the you know, official definitions of the term, like bank accounts and so on, was typically much happier, I think, than life in modern industrial societies, because people had their communities and families, and they were in direct contact with nature in ways that felt right and that nourished them on a moment by moment basis that, you know, modern industrial life just doesn't do.
What just came up in my mind were like three people, you, Richard, and same is true for me. My grandparents came from a really poor farming community in northern Germany, and my grandmother was basically illiterate. They were one generation removed from servitude, basically. And so but you, Yodish, there's only one generation in between. There's like a social moving up in the social scale. And then I noticed in my generation, it started that farming became this kind of like romantic thing, and indigenous cultures meant to be like very romantic. So there is a removal of the hardship. And so I'm thinking about storytelling. What the power that whole, maybe we're constantly telling each other in our cultures the wrong story of the goods versus and then that might prevent us from transition to something that is real, instead of like making up utopian visions that will never hold water and are easily seen that it's a false vision, and then we can never move towards it, because like I'm thinking especially in the global north, but I think also there is this like, to which scale would the global south like move up towards our levels, or is there a third, like some vision that could hold everybody's like equality, and can we envision those kind of things together to get to some transition? So I'm not sure if I made myself clear here.
Yeah, absolutely, the third way. And that's, I think that's the permaculture vision. I've gotten to know the, my wife and I took a permaculture course from one of the founders of permaculture.
Oh, that maybe?
Yeah, and he's gone now, but David Holmgren, who was his student and is also a founder of permaculture, he's still around, and I've had the great good fortune of spending some time with him. And this was their vision from the very beginning, back in the 1970s, when they started permaculture. They realized how unsustainable modern industrial life is, and they never saw this as just a better way of gardening, which many people think of permaculture as, but it's really a whole way. It's a design system for human culture. And it's not fully fleshed out, because human cultures are place-based. So you can't just sit back in your study and design the perfect human culture for everybody everywhere. That would be tyranny. Culture has to grow from the ground up, based on the particular people, the particular climate and soil and water and species that are there. But it has to do so through natural rules, and permaculture, I think, does a good job of revealing what those natural laws and natural rules are, and suggesting how we can move back toward that from where we are, in ways that involve the least amount of having to give up all the good stuff. Maybe ultimately we will have to give up all of the stuff that we think of as good, like the smartphones and apps and social media and all that stuff. Maybe all of that ultimately is completely unsustainable, and we will be able to maintain none of it. I think that's a real possibility.
This is very intimidating. I remember once I was a master's student, and this was October 2nd, birthday of Gandhi. And I mean, the university we were in was very lefty type, so we didn't regard Gandhi as a very very important figure. But one of our professors said that let's try to do, since we are not going to organize speech about Gandhi, and but let's try to live a day of Gandhian lifestyle. And the first condition she imposed on us was to keep away from cell phone. And I must say, no shame. I mean, it's what it is what it is. I survived for about 4 or 5 hours. And then I took up my phone and wrote an email to my professor saying, I give up. I can stay without my phone. And I am not on social media, trust me. And this was a time when I was not even dating, or I mean, I passed that phase. Like I was not 19-year-old that I'm constantly chatting with anyone. But
Yeah.
even the most, daily stuff that I do, scrolling through the Financial Times, or
Right.
that has become such a menacing habit that it's very frightening to think about a world without cell
Of
phones.
course it is. So I spent a year working with a man named David Fridley, who's on the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He's one of the smartest energy guys I know. So the book that we wrote together is called Our Renewable Future. We set ourselves the problem of imagining a post-fossil fuel society based on renewable energy, solar and wind, and how to get there. And I won't try to summarize that for you now because I know we're late in our conversation. We don't have much time. But one of the sectors we looked at was consumer electronics. So we said, okay, how do we transition consumer electronics to work only on renewable energy? And it was the hardest sector we looked at. We looked at transportation, agriculture, and so on. Consumer electronics, once you start digging into it, it's fossil fuels from the beginning to the end. Plastics, extracting scarce materials, transforming them through high heat processes, transporting sub-assemblies from one continent to another. So some poorly paid group of highly skilled people can, do some little process on them before they're shipped to another part of the world for the next stage of assembly, and so on. The only solution we could come up with was for everybody to get their smartphone when they turn 18, and that's it. From then on, if some part breaks, you replace that part. There's no, you get a new cell phone every year or 2 or 3 years. Planned obsolescence has to go. It cannot be sustained. And if we want to keep things like cell phones and computers, we're going to have to do it in a very different way from what we're accustomed to now.
That's
This reminds
interesting
me
that
of
you,
rationing. Sorry, this
Yes.
reminds me
go
of
ahead, Yodesh.
this reminds me of rationing of essential commodities, especially
Yeah.
in the third world and the socialist bloc. How essential commodities always in shortages would be rationed, so you can consume this much and not further. You can't even have businesses profiteer through consumerism,
Right.
insofar as these essential commodities are concerned. But Alka, please go on.
Yeah.
I was just thinking all like with my specific situation, but I think it's still true for a lot of different people in areas. I would have thought that the biggest part is the like my air travel to see my family in Germany, and vice versa. They're coming here. So I'm and then I thought, well, we kind of like substituted that with cell phones or with a computer to stay in contact, but like not have to travel that much. But then on the other end, it's also like that's on the background of the cell phones themselves as well, that we have these satellites, that we have these giant servers, and they are growing by the day.
Yeah,
So
all of that is true. And I'm not saying that consumer electronics is responsible for more carbon emissions than aviation. It's not. But aviation, well, actually, aviation is also going to be extremely difficult to transition to alternative energy. I think realistically, commercial aviation is going to be a shrinking industry from basically from now on. It has no future. But consumer electronics, big problem. And thank you for mentioning rationing, because I think rationing is something that we really should be discussing publicly as a way out of the climate crisis. I don't see any long-term solution to the climate crisis that doesn't involve forms of rationing.
Consumer electronics, it seems like we are moving in the other direction. I mean, I remember my first cell phone, it lasted for 5 years because it wasn't a smartphone. You could just text and you could just call. And so there were no apps that would be updated and slow you down. Now what happens is it's not just the camera that gets outdated. It's not just the music that that you are told you have a better quality now in a different phone, but it's also this online app that gets updated and slows your phone down so you don't feel like and a lot of these apps are made into bigger and bigger size so that your older phones won't be able to hold them together. And
Right.
obviously, with the kind of what Yanis Varoufakis has called as techno-feudalism, more and more services are funneled through these different apps, whether it's booking a cab or buying food from restaurants and so on and so forth. So it seems like we are moving in a different direction. I have a small niece who is 2 years old, and it seems to me that one of the ways of keeping her busy is to give her a cell phone. It's been a lot of headache, her mother or even, people we are around, we can do our work unless you can afford, domestic workers, that's a different thing. But then, hand her a consumer electronics and she would be busy for a little bit of time. You can do your work. So we are moving completely in a different direction, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I want to be really mindful of the time, Richard. We are already over the hour that we wanted to talk to each other, and we covered already so much ground, but it feels like every little thing we touch on opens up another giant field. So I was reminded of the poly crisis that you always like point to. So I think we are talking about exactly that. And as maybe as a closing question, do you want to quickly tell us something about the role of the Post-Carbon Institute in all these fields that we kind of like touched on here and there? Like, what would be the future of the post-carbon, or could be like the role, the future, and for further discussions, I don't know.
Yeah, well, the Post-Carbon Institute has been around for 20 years. We're a small nonprofit think tank headquartered on the west coast of the US. And we have basically 10 full-time staff, and they live all over the place. So Post-Carbon Institute wouldn't exist without the internet. Nevertheless, we're using these tools while they exist for the purpose of imagining a transition to a post-fossil fuel society. What kinds of choices will be imposed on us? What choices can we make voluntarily that will ease the transition, make it faster or more comfortable or fairer? And that's a lot. So
Yeah.
we've published many books and reports and videos and so on. So if you go to postcarbon.org, or our daily updated sort of news site is resilience.org. If you go to those sites, you can access an enormous amount of information, and hopefully a lot of it is entertaining and enlightening as well as scary.
Could there also, or do you have partners in the global south that there can be like cross-pollination of like ideas and like limits to power? What would be our strategies and stuff?
Increasingly that's the case. We have a network called the Liminality Network that is by invitation, a network of people largely from the global south whom we're working with, both to learn from them and also to share ideas with them, and that's informing a lot of the work that we're doing increasingly.
I want to let you go with a very quick question. You can just answer in like 3 words or 4 words probably. And this is something I felt while talking to you, so I am very tempted to ask you. Having within this conversation, I felt as if we are talking about a world where we should be connected to not just each other, but also different species, various things which we generally regard as non-living things. So there's a disconnect there. And I interviewed once Vandana Shiva, who is based in India, and she also talks a lot about environment. And I felt that there can be a role of spirituality, not in the religious forms, but insofar as connecting ourselves to things. Have you ever felt any spiritual impulse from within this
I've
project?
I've I've uh, I've spent decades of my life wrestling with religion and spirituality in various forms, writing and teaching various forms of comparative religion, history of religion and philosophy, and so on. So that has been a big part of my life. And I think, yes, as we get back in touch with community in a face-to-face way and the community of nature, one of the great benefits will be a sense of awe and wonder and connectedness that we can, you can call that spirituality, you can call it anything you want, but I think it's something that's largely missing from our lives today. And I think it could be a huge benefit. Religion, organized religion, I'm not so sure about, but spirituality in the sense that I was just talking about it, I think that's very important.
Richard Heinberg, thank you so much.
It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.